While the West is being destroyed from the inside by an autoimmune disease, also known as collective guilt syndrome, it simultaneously faces a number of external, increasingly aggressive totalitarian forces, most prominently that of radical Islam. And on the frontier of this conflict, both militarily and ideologically speaking, we find Israel. In this video series, I'm going to address the most common arguments and points of criticism used against Israel with regards to its current operation in Gaza and its actions towards its enemies as a whole. I will demonstrate how most of this criticism is either deceptive or logically incoherent, and one argument at a time, I will give you the most precise and concise way to dismantle those arguments completely. Without further ado, I give you the case for Israel. So one of the most common claims is that Israel is acting in an immoral manner in Gaza, exactly because it is responding disproportionately to what happened on October 7th. On October 7th, Hamas killed between 1,100 and 1,200 people. And on top of that, they took 251 hostages. At the same time, since October 7th, the Israelis have killed approximately 40,000 people in Gaza. Now, apart from pointing out that these numbers are highly questionable, as our main source is of course the Hamas-run health ministry in Gaza, which is needless to say, difficult to regard as a trustworthy source. How do we counter such an intuitive claim? As I said, Hamas kills 1,200, takes a number of hostages. The Israelis kill 40,000. Just looking at these numbers alone, this is completely disproportionate, right? And therefore, I guess it must be immoral. Well, first, by demonstrating how this entire argument is essentially nothing but deception. Let's look at why this is the case. The thing is, what people have to recognize is that claiming that Israel's actions are immoral on the basis of them being disproportional is the same thing as claiming that a proportional response would be moral. Therefore, in order to demonstrate how and why this claim is deceptive in nature, when speaking to someone making this claim, just try to suggest the following. Let's just say that after October 7th, we allow the IDF to invade Gaza, just as they already have, of course. But this time, let's do it with an entirely different approach. Let's say that instead of specifically targeting Hamas, the IDF goes into Gaza, rounds up exactly the same number of people that Hamas killed on October 7th. And of course, it needs to be completely representative. Same number of militant actors, same number of civilians in general, same number of men, women, pregnant women, same number of children at various ages. Let's say that we allow the IDF to murder the exact same number of men, women, and children. Let's say that we allow the IDF to rape exactly the same number of women. Let's say that we allow the IDF to torture and kill the exact same number of parents in front of their children. Let's say that we allow the IDF to torture and kill exactly the same number of children in front of their parents. Let's say that we allow the IDF to cut off exactly the same number of genitals as Hamas did on October 7th. Let's say that we allow the IDF to burn the same number of people alive. Let's say that we allow the IDF to cut open the stomachs of pregnant women, pulling out the fetuses on exactly the same number of women as Hamas did on October 7th. Let's say that we allow the IDF to take away infants from their mothers and put exactly the same number of children into microwave ovens, just as Hamas did on October 7th. So on and so forth. And the thing is, you will quickly come to realize that nobody believes this. I don't believe this. You don't believe this. People making the claim that proportionality is morality don't believe it either. And the reason is that we are not savages. And of course, because we've been indoctrinated with a Jewish Christian value framework, which means that this kind of barbarism, in general, we don't even do this to our enemies. And as I already said, the people who claim that Israel's response is immoral because it is disproportionate, they don't believe either that Israel should do any of the things that I just listed a moment ago. In other words, these people simultaneously believe that a disproportionate response is immoral, while at the same time believing that a proportionate response is immoral. And the truth behind this deceptive claim is of course essentially that you are only defending yourself in a moral manner if you are responding in a less than proportionate manner compared to the aggressor. In other words, what you're essentially doing is promoting a worldview which ultimately favors the aggressor of any conflict. The aggressor gets to decide where and when the conflict takes place. The aggressor gets to decide the level of escalation. The aggressor gets to run away and hide behind civilians, while at the same time the person or entity defending itself is morally compelled to submit to the will of the aggressor. In other words, might is right. By saying it, we are adopting a moral framework which states that as the aggressor, you can more or less do what you want, and the person or entity defending itself has to limit its response. Even if you are a consequentialist or a utilitarian, meaning you don't really care that much about the freedom of the individual to defend itself necessarily, but you do care about collective welfare, you do care about maximizing welfare, you do care about minimizing casualties, minimizing civilian casualties, then the thing is, you have to ask yourself, even in that case, what is the most most efficient way to do so? Well, first you have to recognize that war and violent conflict entails destruction, death, and misery. And therefore, if you want to minimize these things, if you want to minimize casualties, what you essentially want to do is maximize peace. In other words, you want to minimize the risk that wars occur to begin with. Then how do we do that? First, of course, by recognizing that violent conflicts and wars are started by someone. In any given conflict, there's an aggressor. And if you really want to minimize the likelihood of wars ever occurring, the answer is not taking away people or nations' ability to defend themselves. Instead, the rational way to do it is to take away the incentive to commit an act of aggression. And you do that by convincing potential future aggressors that it doesn't make sense to start a war, that the cost of doing so will be significantly higher than the potential benefits of doing so. If you make sure that any potential future aggressor always faces a cost-benefit ratio where the perceived costs of starting a war are always higher than the perceived benefits, you minimize the likelihood of war. And this is the reason why making the claim that proportionality is morality, not only is this claim deceptive in nature, it's also dangerous. Because here you're doing the exact opposite. Not only from a deontologically individualist perspective is this immoral, because you're essentially saying that an individual or a nation should not have the freedom to defend itself, to maintain its own existence, to maintain its own freedom. But even from a utilitarian or collective perspective, this is wrong. Because by promoting such an idea, you are not decreasing the likelihood of war. You are increasing the likelihood of war occurring to begin with. Why? Because you are lowering the perceived costs of engaging in an act of aggression, thereby effectively increasing the incentive to aggress. Even though you might claim that you are not sympathetic towards the aggressor, even though you might try to persuade people around you that you're essentially critical towards both sides, what you're doing is promoting a structure which effectively favors the aggressor. And as a result, you are not promoting peace. You're telling any future potential aggressors the following: you can invade a country. We're not sympathetic towards it. You choose to do it anyway, so you invade another country. Now, the country defending itself needs to do it with its hands tied on its back. And should it try to defend itself, and should it be able to defend itself efficiently enough, the aggressor can use its own civilians as human shields. And as a consequence of that, the entity defending itself, who never chose to be a part of that conflict to begin with, the entity defending itself now suddenly cannot defend itself. And again, when you're telling the entity defending itself that it cannot do anything about this, that it cannot shoot or kill human shields in order to get to the terrorists or in order to get to the aggressor, again, both from an individualist perspective, this is immoral because I did not choose to enter into that conflict. So of course I should have the freedom to defend myself. But also from a peace perspective, you are showing any future potential aggressors that this is a sound strategy, that it makes perfect sense to be the aggressor because the costs are relatively low, that it makes sense to take hostages because the entity defending itself is much more interested in saving the hostages than it is interested in winning the war, that it makes sense to use human shields because the whole world promotes a moral framework which states that the entity defending itself has to protect the human shields of the aggressor. All of this, deontologically speaking, it takes away the freedom of the individual to maintain its own existence and freedom. From a utilitarian perspective, from a peace perspective, from an efficiency perspective, it increases the likelihood of war in the future. And because war always entails civilian casualties, you are essentially promoting a structure which will lead to many more civilian casualties in the future. So by promoting the claim that proportionality is morality, by promoting a structure which favors the aggressor, you are essentially promoting death and destruction, not peace.